Alex Chula, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Well, it is my pleasure to have you on, and also, by way of a brief preamble for listeners, it is a very happy circumstance that Alex finds himself on the show, because we met at Bijan Omrani's book launch for God is an Englishman. He is also a former guest of the show, and we met in passing, and then we managed to track each other down and make this conversation happen. And it was through Bijan putting you in touch with me that I found that you'd written a wonderful book called Goodbye, Dr. Banda, Lessons for the West from a Small African Country. And it's about your time in Malawi before you got into your medical career. And so, Alex, I'll have you tell us what you learned and why you think Malawi has lessons for the West and Britain. And perhaps we begin with that, because actually your time there amongst its people and learning its history subverted fashionable narratives about British Empire, colonial oppression, and slavery. So tell us how.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, John. Yes, so I found myself in Malawi by accident. It's a small, landlocked, impoverished country in southern Africa that most people will never visit, and many people may never even have heard of. Yes, I mean, certainly from a marketing point of view, it's been extremely difficult to explain why people should divert their attention to this place. But my focus with the book was thinking about how Westerners have interacted with Malawi, using it as a case study of how Westerners interact with other cultures more generally. And I was thinking very much about the present as well as the past, but there is quite a lot of historical context that does need to be laid down, and I think a lot of that context is itself interesting from the point of view of how we in Britain regard our history at the moment, because Malawi was part of the British Empire, and yet I think it comes clear from my book that its experience of imperial rule was obviously a mixed one, as was probably that of any country that experienced imperial rule. But I try to suggest a predominantly positive one, and certainly one that subverts prevailing narratives, as you say, about imperial rule being a story of unalloyed evil, of colonial repression, but also one which I think tells an important but very neglected story about the history of slavery, which tends to get lost in the furore about the transatlantic slave trade.
That works.
So, I mean, I think the thing to consider is that this is the territory that became known to Britain through David Livingstone. This was the territory that obsessed him, and the reason it obsessed Livingstone was because once the transatlantic slave trade had been suppressed, the largest in the world was that being conducted on Africa's east coast, by a number of actors, but predominantly by Omani Arabs, who had a vast empire, which was expanding quite rapidly at the time that Livingstone encountered the region in the middle of the 19th century, stretching all the way from the northernmost tip of Portuguese territory in today's Mozambique, up to the borderlands between Kenya and Somalia today. And this territory, this empire had been so successful that the Omani Arabs had actually recentered their capital from Muscat in Oman to Zanzibar. And on Zanzibar, there was the largest slave market in the world at the time that Livingstone was exploring the hinterland. Now, the slaves were drawn from a very, very wide territory within Central Africa, but among them, Malawi was particularly important because it was, relatively speaking, quite a populous territory. And this was a land which, when Livingstone arrived there, conditions could fairly be described as hell on earth. So massive disruption of settled agriculture, of settled communities through persistent slave raiding by the Arabs, but also by Islamized tribes acting as their accomplices. And the result has been a condition of recurrent famine. I mean, let alone, I mean, it not only does it inhibit any sort of development, I mean, it simply inhibits basic subsistence farming. So it was a land of starvation, of terror. But Malawi suffers even more because it finds itself at the nexus of different forces. So not only do you have the slave traders coming in from the east, you've also got Portuguese slavers, specifically a class of mixed race Portuguese African robber barons who are particularly brutal and have carved out fiefdoms in the area and terrorizing local societies in the broad territory of Malawi. But then to add to this, you then have the Ongoni, who are a breakaway tribe from the Zulu diaspora coming up from the south, who have brought the martial prowess of the Zulus and are very much fighting sort of it's very much of a land grab, but a very brutal one in Malawi. So it's a land that whose societies were really being devastated, and Livingstone's perception was that there was no way of redeeming, improving the situation apart from by the introduction of the notorious three C's, which causes so much embarrassment today. That is Christianity, civilization, and, because he was a realist and recognized there was a need to pay for it, commerce. I mean, it's worth reflecting that it was a very different situation to the transatlantic slave trade, which had been relatively easily suppressed by naval policing. This wasn't possible on the Swahili coast, the Indian Ocean, because it's a trade being conducted in a myriad of tiny coastal hugging vessels, and these large British men of war can't get in close enough to the coast to spot them. It's a long, friendly coastline which is under the control, or notionally under the control of the Sultan of Zanzibar. And so Livingstone really is convinced that it has to be by missionary settlement deep in the interior as the only way of controlling this problem at the source. And British involvement in the region is driven by this missionary motive, by this early humanitarian motive. The British government actually absorbs it as a protectorate in 1891. Only with the utmost reluctance, because it's a territory which is very little strategic interest, very little resources. But the missionaries have before that already gone in on a very, very isolated missions to try to suppress slavery, and have actually done such an extraordinary job in doing so that the impetus grows in Britain, and pressure is put on the government that really they ought to be supporting this endeavour. But it is an astonishing accomplishment what the missionaries that followed Livingstone managed to achieve in this territory. I mean, I always used to find it almost inexplicable how such a large swathe of people on the earth could have been converted to an alien religion without the use of force by a handful of men acting in extraordinarily difficult and dangerous circumstances. But I think the reality is that conditions there were so appalling when the early missionaries from Britain arrived in the territory that when strangers arrived offering a message of peace on earth and goodwill to all men, it was embraced very, very enthusiastically. And I think a testament to this is that although these figures are consigned to almost total oblivion in Britain today, um, they are still remembered very warmly in the territory of Malawi. Um, a period of colonial rule follows, which the record is mixed. But overall, I think that achievement in bringing in extirpating slavery remarkably peacefully and establishing a security to the region which it had not known for for many generations before, must be counted as one of the great moral achievements of the whole British imperial project.
Alex, there are a lot of threads on that we are going to pull on like mad throughout this conversation, not least Christianity, not least what this means for Dr. Banda and his relationship to Britain, and indeed the flowering, I suppose, at least for a time, of civil society in these places. But perhaps before we start getting into those meaty elements of the story of Malawi and your time there, let's hear about how you found yourself there, because very amusingly, at the beginning of the book, you write about having studied classics at Oxford with this kind of a sense of perhaps self-satisfaction, I think, which you talk about amongst your peers, that you're at Oxford, you're studying classics, you're all that, and you're also highly sought after by corporate firms, and you talk about how there are magic circle firms, those in the law profession and much else besides, that were effectively courting you all at these events, giving you free food and drink, and come on, you'll be great here, as is so often the case for the a good percentage of our graduate class in this country. Um, why why did you find yourself in Malawi, and why did you not go down the route of the cushy corporate life?
Yes, I mean, well, the simple answer is rather by accident, it should be said. So I'm actually a medical doctor, but I've taken a rather meandering course into medicine. As you say, studied classics for my first degree, um, and towards the end of my classics degree, it sort of became apparent that most of my peers were being drawn towards the world of law, the world of finance in London, which did not appeal to me at all. Indeed, I sort of rather recoiled from it and looked for work elsewhere. And I had a probably sort of entirely fanciful romantic notion that I might find something to do in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it would have been very easy for me to have washed up as one of the aid or development workers that I end up lambasting somewhat in the book. That was sort of the idea I half had in my mind. But in the midst of looking for such a post, I came across an advert for a teacher of Latin and Greek in Malawi, and reflected that it was probably the only job on the entire continent that I was actually qualified to do. So I applied for it and ended up having one of the most formative experiences of my life there. It was wonderful, and it was the beginning of a long infatuation with Malawi, which continues, to today. I later came back to the UK and studied medicine, and then I was able to return to Malawi as a doctor. So I've had the chance to see the country from different perspectives. But my first acquaintance with the country was through this very, very bizarre academy established by Malawi's very eccentric and very Anglophile dictator Hastings Banda, who thought that the study of Greco-Roman civilization was the way to advance development in Africa.
I think what is striking about the book is that, well, you can tell you're a classic student, that's for sure, because of your deep understanding of Greek and Latin literature and the culture that it bequeathed the West, so to speak. And um, what you notice throughout the book is you're obviously writing it biographically. You're writing your observations on the people of every class. Though different class systems are here in Britain, that's for sure. Um, but you have a real sense of where it is that you come from, which is also an interesting conversation for us to have, because I know that is also fraught for you with your mixed heritage, your English and Thai heritage. So we'll get onto that in a moment. But you do have a real sense of where you come from, and you learned the follies of modern Britain and modern civilization through having been exposed to a country that was very much, I suppose, in the ashes of an attempt of implementing a Greco-Roman based civilization, um, trying to bring all of the best of institutions and literature and culture so that Banda's own people could flourish. You were able to see right up front just how much value there is in British civilization within Western civilization more broadly by having been exposed to others without diminishing theirs either. And you just mentioned a lot of your friends who went to Oxbridge found themselves in finance and law, and I've rubbed shoulders with that profession or those professions in my career. And I think what I'm struck by is how few people have the sense of who they are, where they're from, like you express in your book. And I'm sure you get that from classics. I'm sure you get that almost from your mixed heritage, because it helps you reflect even more on identity and all the rest of it. But the amount of people who are graduates, uh, high performing graduates from red brick universities, Russell Group universities, that go on to occupy the professional elite of the country, who have almost no understanding, basically zero, of the civilization of which they're effectively the stewards of at this point. You know, they are the ones that are pulling the strings for our future direction in many ways. And they're passing nothing on meaningfully and almost have no reflection on it, because they're so materially focused on adding value in the corporate context, on growth, but there's nothing to say about where they're from, why that's important, or even if there's anything good about it. Are these observations that you've had too, or am I just an overblown cynic?
No, no, I think you've expressed very well a lot of thoughts that I've had. Um, I mean, I think my background of being half Thai, half British has always, I think for a long time I found aspects of that uncomfortable, feeling that in some ways I was condemned to always feel slightly ill at ease, never fully at home in either world. But as I've grown older, I think that slight outsider status is one that I've come to embrace, because I think it has just allowed me the huge advantage of having the constant compare and contrast of these two wildly different societies between Thailand and England, um, and so being able to see each one, I suppose, with to some extent fresh eyes. I mean, Thailand is curious because in many ways, it could be held up as a sort of poster boy for the universalist idea that actually, if we just yes get the governance and economic prosperity okay, then everywhere's basically the same. Um, I think Thailand really flies under the radar as quite how strange a country it is. It's got it's got all of the appurtenances of a modern Western state, but it's a very eccentric country, and one that, because of my the intimacy which if I know it, I categorize is so wildly different from England. But the acquaintance with both has, I suppose, given me an appreciation, an awareness of how different societies are, and an appreciation for for the differences in each. And so perhaps that's what you've got in mind when you think of people who've known only England, but have grown up somehow oblivious to the enormous cultural, spiritual wealth that of which they are, of which they should be the inheritors.
You also reference, Alex, I think in the introduction to the book, that having been born in South London to one English, one Thai parent, and as you've just explained, not necessarily feeling entirely comfortable in either culture. Maybe we can meditate a little bit on multicultural England and your thoughts on that, because I think it's probably fair to say, and I think you do pick up on this later on in the book. You mentioned that you're an anywhere person. This is a term that David Goodhart has popularized. That around 15 to 20% of the population are anywhere people. They can be at home anywhere in the world because they have a more a kind of free and easy mixing with other cultures and civilizations, and find the similarities, and generally are more bohemian and cosmopolitan in their outlook. But that's not how everyone's wired, and the other 80% are broadly split quite evenly between somewhere people, those rooted to time, place, people, tradition. You know, they're not going to leave within 45 miles of where they were born and grown up, and they're still very rooted, regional identity, all the rest of it. And then there are the people in the middle. I think it's fair to say that that London cosmopolitan outlook is pretty much localized to the university towns of the country, the towns and cities of the country. And so the somewhere view of what England is and what their regional identity is very different to the London view. Is that also what you mean when you say you don't feel fully part almost of England and Englishness because you're from the cosmopolitan centre with the multicultural celebration that goes on, which is something that most of the rest of the country actually isn't particularly a fan of?
Yes, or of Thailand and Thailand for that matter. No, absolutely. I mean, I think I characterize myself very much as an anywhere person in the book, but I felt for large chunks of my life like a sort of anywhere person yearning to be a somewhere person, and I think one of the huge attractions of Malawi was to encounter people who were so quintessentially somewhere people, so quintessentially rooted in a particular place, a particular time, a particular community, with such powerful bonds of kinship and locality. But and perhaps that's something we can touch on later. But certainly my upbringing in the sort of what in the cosmopolitan world of multicultural South London was the basis for my misgivings about the multicultural project, because I grew up being in so many ways sort of a perfect exemplar of that, being mixed race, having a foot in two very different worlds, um, and yet I found there was something so insipid about that, about the celebration of that experience. Um, it felt to me like it was so difficult to get a proper handle on even just one culture, let alone two, that as soon as the project's extended to the vast multiplicity that you have in London, it becomes completely fatuous to imagine that you might have anything other than the most superficial engagement with any one of any one of those cultures. And I mean, I grew up with multicultural friends, and that was the case in Thailand as well as in the UK, who were sort of part of that sort of international anywhere society. And I remember being struck on a number of occasions by how dismal and homogenous that society was. I remember going to parties and being amongst people who every person present was mixed race like myself, um, and with a foot in multiple continents, and yet somehow the shared culture between them was somehow absolutely the same. Everybody had been to similar international schools all around the world. Everybody had the same interests. You were sort of inescapable conversations about yoga or capoeira or vegan food. It was a complete uniformity to the cultural experience, which could not have been more different from when I then was able to set foot in Malawi, where you actually had a culture that had a real integrity to it, and that was so refreshing.
Let's linger for a moment on the insipid culture as you describe it. Uh, it's something that I've experienced fleetingly. I think insofar as I've joined friends who are on their own sabbatical travel years and all the rest of it, and finding myself in hostels, whether in Colombia or Peru, which basically feel like an outpost of that universalist European um, middle class culture, I suppose, which is very global in its outlook, morally relativist in many ways, culturally relativist too, and it's very you do you. Um, you have several amusing observations that you make in the book. Um, and one of them is your experience of people who work for non-governmental organizations. Typically, they're doing humanitarian work, and you'll be better to tell the story. So, you're someone who arrives there as a Latin and Greek scholar, there to teach these ancient languages. And the other Westerners that you come across are typically there doing NGO humanitarian work. Um, what was your take on what they're about and their engagement with the culture, the people, the history?
Yes, so that I suppose is the focus of my critique of that world. I mean, obviously, the more pertinent critique would be that of the complete failure of any of these um, of the international development industry to achieve anything. Certainly in Malawi, I mean, Malawi is the country which Rory Stewart famously described as a place where we spent £4.5 billion of British taxpayers' money, and the country is somehow poorer than when we started. Um, I mean, I'm not a development economist. Uh, the critiques of that world, that system, have been done very, very well indeed by, I mean, recently Dambisa Moyo's book Dead Aid. But I mean, it's been going on for a long time before that. I mean, certainly Peter Bauer's work in the 1970s, exposing the absurdity and the futility of international development endeavors. But I suppose what I was trying to contribute was a focus on the cultural side of it, um, the culture which international aid professionals, international development professionals export or carry with them to the rest of the world, um, and it struck me as deeply depressing because the context of Malawi, as I was saying at the start of the program, is one in which there were, if you like, the proto humanitarians, the proto workers, were there in the middle of the 19th century, and then up until the end of British rule in the 1960s. and achieved so much and sacrificed so much to achieve what they did, embraced lives of real hardship and danger, and so many of them gave their lives to the cause of improving this remote corner of the world, which had in so many ways nothing whatsoever to do with Britain. Um, and yet their successes, quite apart from how little they've actually achieved, despite vastly greater resources and vastly greater technology to facilitate whatever they're doing, um, are so contemptuous when they're not ignorant of that record. And so the book was in some ways written in a sort of fit of indignation about how dishonored have been those early figures who really did make a big difference to conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. But on the cultural side, there's this sort of fantasy we have today that um, we're now sort of so open-minded and sensitive and enthusiastic about other cultures. We're to be congratulated for our multiculturalism, and that this is in contrast with the bad old days of the past when our forebears were all their approach was to be characterized by bigotry and racism and Eurocentrism. And yet, when you sort of drill into the reality of what international development workers, how they engage with local societies today versus those forebears, even and especially in the bad old days of the Victorian era, it becomes obvious that today we approach very remote, wildly different cultures with vastly less respect and curiosity than our forebears, certainly the best of our forebears, did in the past. And it's the superficiality of that engagement with local cultures that I could see in Malawi that appalled me so much. I mean, on the most fundamental level, in the international development industry, people don't spend very long in the countries where they go to work. You swap one dysfunctional country for another as you make your way up the career ladder. 3 years or so is considered a long stint in one place. That does not allow for any meaningful engagement with local peoples, local languages, especially in societies where so much is transacted on a very, very personal level. But the complete incuriosity about local cultures was to me also staggering. I mean, so few of those that I regularly encountered showed any interest in the history of the country or its ethnography, when these are so fundamental to the situation there today. And I was left with this overwhelming impression that actually what they were there for was basically a job that sort of resembled a holiday. And I think this is sadly one of the reasons why such an ineffectual system of international development has been perpetuated, is because the major actors in it, whether they're the recipients of aid, on a political level in these usually very corrupt countries, or the development workers themselves, there's a vested interest in continuing it, because if you're a development worker in Malawi, you live a really splendid life. I mean, your salary might not be that substantial by Western standards, but by local standards, it's enormous, and you can live like royalty, and you are treated with enormous respect. And it's a very congenial country with lovely white sand beaches by the lake, and the whole thing has enough of a frisson of adventure and exoticism to add a glamour to your life. But the actual engagement with the country, I always found to be so limited. And the slightly depressing conclusion that I reached was that I think the disparity because I think some of these people are in some ways conscientious. They are caring people. They would like to see the world somehow magically made a better place, and they are very conscious of the enormous material disparity between their lives and local peoples. At the same time, completely impotent to do anything about that, and they certainly don't want to reduce their own material circumstances to a level of equality. So instead, what you get is a great uh, exhibition of informality, of false fraternity with local peoples, because that's how one flatters oneself as a Westerner that actually maybe the gulf isn't so vast between us and them after all. Um, Maybe actually, yes, the universalist ideas that I brought out with me can still hold true. But then, what do? They cultivate that very informal local relationships. Uh, they go and kick a football around a village with some villagers. Maybe they pose with a child on their shoulders for a photo. Maybe they have a fleeting relationship with someone in the country, and then they go, and then it's over. And I think it is so obvious to local peoples how fleeting and how insincere is the um, attempt to satisfy these people attempt to satisfy themselves that they are forming a meaningful connection with the countries in which they spend time. And it's, I suppose, the thing that makes it feel rather pointed in the current situation in Britain is that, for the most part, I don't think it's controversial to say that um, professionals in the development industry are generally politically liberal. They are classic. They would be sort of classic proponents of the multicultural agenda in their own country, and yet when you actually see them, how they envisage interaction with other people's cultures when they go and spend time in their countries,
Mm.
you realize how utterly shallow their engagement is.
They live in their own monoculture. Yes, there's a grim irony to that. And you talked about the liberal inclinations of these aid workers. Uh, this is all happening post Hastings Banda, who, as you write in the book, actually expelled hippies, liberal journalists, and the US Peace Corps from the country. He said, if this is Western civilization, you can keep it. Uh, is there any more you can add to that? What was seen as so deleterious about these people's presence in the country when Banda was trying to build Malawi on Western foundations?
I mean, maybe we need to delve a bit into who Dr. Banda,
Yes.
because I suppose the uh, part of the only part of the reason I felt sort of impelled to write the book was that Banda was a um, really totemic figure of the post-colonial period in Africa, and for a time a figure of very significant international renown, who has also faded into obscurity. Um, but he what and the book is only very partly a highly selective biography of Banda. It just happened that his life, which of about 100 years spanning pretty much the whole 20th century, provided a very convenient narrative backbone to the book. Um, but the it will not surprise listeners to learn that Banda, as an African dictator, was a very flawed figure indeed, and I hope my book does not shy away from the dysfunctionality, the corruption, and I'm afraid the brutality of his rule, especially towards the end. Um, but I've tried to give a fair and perhaps a slightly sympathetic assessment of this very, very curious, even by the recurring standards of post-colonial Africa, this very curious leader. And the focus of my interest and the reason I sort of felt it was a story that was relevant to the West today is there's something very poignant in the fact that at precisely the era when the West is abandoning or repudiating the cornerstones of its civilization, you have in this tiny remote country a final, rather feeble attempt to fly the flag for Western civilization, especially its Greco-Roman antecedents, by an African dictator who had actually begun his political career as an ardent anti-colonialist. And I think to I think to explain this, we probably need to delve somewhat into the life of Banda, if time will permit that, John.
Please do.
So Banda grows up in a peasant family, subsistence farmers in the late 1890s, in what is now Malawi, and this is a society which has not achieved the written word, does not have the wheel, does not have the plough, and yet suddenly, and is suffering from the appalling predations which I described right at the start of our conversation, from slave raiding from the Omani Arabs and incursions of the warrior Ngoni from the south and so on. And then there is the arrival of Scottish missionaries who teach this young village boy who's known only a life of subsistence farming and insecurity, basic literacy and numeracy, for which he has a remarkable aptitude. And hears rumor of other places on the continent that if he could just get them, he could secure for himself a better education. And so he actually sets off as a teenager on foot to walk 1,500 miles to South Africa, and he's trying to get to a missionary institute called Lovedale, because, among other things, he's heard that. Well, first of all, it's reputed to offer the best education available to Black Africans anywhere on the continent, and in particular, it's known to offer Latin and Greek, which to his perception is the ultimate prestige subject when one is trying to embrace this exciting new culture of literacy that's emerged. You want to go to its earliest possible in its finest antecedents. But he doesn't make it to Lovedale. He ends up having to work in the mines in Joburg. But from there, he goes to evening classes. He manages to get a scholarship through church groups, of all places, to the US. And in America, he then spends 12 years in full-time adult education, studying history, classics, liberal arts. Then he dabbles in some anthropology with a very prominent Black American anthropologist called Mark Hannah Watkins, takes a history degree from the University of Chicago, and then switches to medicine, becomes a doctor, then comes to the UK to practice in Scotland and then London, and basically has pretty much a full medical career before the winds of change begin sweeping African nationalist leaders back to the continent. And Banda has by his experience and education is sort of so clearly the most sophisticated and to be admitted most competent man to run the country. So he after a brief period of antagonism with the British, sort of reconciles with them and is installed at independence, makes himself president for life very soon after that. But in later in his presidency, which then goes on for 30 years, and remember he's already in his 60s when he comes back to Malawi, having had his career as a doctor in the UK. he embarks on this rather quixotic program to promote the Western culture with which he becomes so infatuated as a student in America. And the biggest dream is to actually create a university in Malawi, so that Malawians don't have to do what he did, which is walk 1,500 miles to another country in order to go and search for an education. So he founds the University of Malawi fairly early on. Um, but as he gets older, his eccentricity deepens and his obsession with classics deepens, and he ends up sort of wanting to establish classics departments at the university and establish this elite academy specifically to promote the study of Latin and Greek. But the the poignancy is that as this is happening, what he's observing is the rejection of this culture and the lowest sort of, to his eye, the lowest um, forms of Western culture sort of rocking up in Malawi. So he uh, becomes very censorious, and the list of things that he decides to censor is rather magnificent. He doesn't like. There's a wonderful list that was available at every airport in point of entry to Malawi of forbidden books, which included things like Simone de Beauvoir and Nabokov, John Berger, um, the music of Paul Simon. But he was also, disgusted by hippies who refused entry. People with long hair were forced to have a short back and sides on entry. Bell-bottom trousers were elaborate legal prohibition was devised to ensure that, as he put it, bell-bottom trousers would never see the light of day in Malawi. The U.S. Peace Corps was kicked out. Jehovah's Witnesses. So the quote you said, his attitude was, if that's Western civilization, you can keep it, because this is someone who was obviously had developed such a deep affection for Western culture as a result of very rigorous study of that culture. So to then encounter, yes, people who have come from that, who have just rejected and showing no interest in that tradition, rocking up in Malawi to live a hippie lifestyle of smoking marijuana on the lakeshore, was understandably abhorrent to him.
Final couple of sentences there about Banda wondering how Westerners could disavow that rich heritage in some way and actually negate it, often consciously, caused him clearly a lot of alarm and distress, and didn't want any of that. Just wanted to keep the good parts. It reminded me a little bit of, well, she's American now, but the Somalian Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who found herself in Europe effectively as an asylum seeker because she broke away from an arranged marriage. She was en route to arranged marriage. I think he may have been a cousin. I can't quite remember, but he lived on the continent, and she sought refuge while she was in Frankfurt. Was deeply Muslim and deeply Somali at the time culturally, because that's all she'd ever known. And yet, having found herself in Netherlands, having claimed asylum, and then being taught all of the great classics of Western civilization and political thought, all of her previous ideas about the world melted away, and she realized this was something worth fighting for, the dignity of the individual, and then all of the great fruits of the civilization itself. And now she has had to obviously move to America, partly because of her husband, but partly because ultimately, as she sees it, the West has given up on itself. Western countries have given up on themselves. So it doesn't recognize attacks from strident Muslims on the culture, both physical threats that were made on her life, and indeed saw some of her colleagues murdered by Islamists. She thought this is a culture that no longer wants to defend itself, and it is very decadent. And yet, look at it. There is every means of its salvation right here. If only we were to take it seriously once more and believe in it. So it's interesting. Perhaps talks a little bit to your outsider status yourself. Is that often being on the periphery and getting a deep understanding of something can help you become more attached to it and convinced of its virtues, rather than taking it for granted and doing the whole kind of teenage rebellion thing that you never quite grow out of. Um, yes, I don't know if that's something you also thought, but as you were talking there about the ethos of these Scottish missionaries that had influenced Banda, um, you've already talked about him, Livingston, but there is a section within the book that's dedicated to the Overtown Institute, which I believe Livingston had set up, and it was very much based on missionary work. So I think it's important for us to get into what you've already described as the motivations of these Christian evangelicals, these missionaries, um, because we can probably do a bit of a compare and contrast with the secular West, which we've already partly done. So, can you tell us a bit about the Overtown Institute's ethos, what it sought to achieve whilst it was there in Malawi for the people?
Yes. So, I mean, I think maybe the place starts to go back to Banda for a second and acknowledge that I'm sure to many listeners, the idea of sort of promotion of classics in sub-Saharan Africa must seem certainly absurd, possibly grotesque. And he was lambasted for this project, especially by the sort of the post-colonial thinkers of the second half of the 20th century, for whom, I mean, Banda is absolutely grist to their mill. So the Kenyan critic who died recently, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote sort of the seminal book, The Colonized Mind. Banda is like the perfect example for him of the colonized mind, and the academy that I ended up at is a quintessential product of that for him. But I'm there obviously are aspects of the project which are absurd. What Ngugi and others completely miss, and by the way, it tends to only ever be Westerners or Western educated critics who are vehemently opposed to who are most outraged by Banda's project rather than native Malawians, in my experience. What I think they miss is that Banda's idea for promoting classics and Western Greco-Roman culture in Malawi is not actually some aberration that comes completely out of nowhere. It's not some sort of perverse personal peccadillo of his. It's actually consistent with a tradition of high intellectual academic ambition, which completely suffuses Malawi's history from the first contact with the early missionaries. And which Banda was very much, very explicitly referring to and drawing on. So obviously there is the evangelization element, which is central, but alongside that, Livingston and those that followed him had a very lofty educational program. It was not the Overton Institute which you mentioned is perhaps sort of the most striking example of this, but actually it was consistent amongst a lot of the early missionaries, and that's because when Livingstone returned to England from his expeditions in Malawi and appealed for volunteers to come and take up his crusade against slavery, the first place that he went was the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. And dozens and dozens of young men answered his appeal. Young men who were of some of the highest intellectual and moral caliber that Britain has ever produced. And they were classicists, physicians, linguists, mathematicians, musicologists. And they were, in so many cases, giving up highly lucrative opportunities elsewhere as they graduated from Oxbridge, in order to go to a very remote place in Central Africa, where most of them uh, were not just aware of the risk of dying, but actually expected to die there, possibly without ever having made it back to Britain again in the interim. Um, but they brought with them the academic ambition of Oxbridge and the high intellectual culture of Oxbridge, and tried to transplant it to Malawi. So that was one current. The second current was a Scottish Presbyterian tradition, which was more austere, but no less ambitious. And this was figures from a sort of background that Livingstone himself came from. So Livingstone's grows up in complete destitution. His family are from the Hebridean island of Ulva, where there is literally nothing for a large family that his parents had to subsist on. So they moved to a mill town outside Glasgow. And the children will go to work on the spinning jennies from an early age. But there's a school, and they educate themselves. And Livingstone himself teaches himself Latin and is able to read Horace and Virgil from books propped up on the spinning jenny. And you can see his um, books if you go to the Livingstone Museum. No parallel text or anything, just the Latin, which is not something that graduates of Oxford, I can assure you, can do today. But he and a handful of other Scottish Presbyterian missionaries had very similar backgrounds. They'd emerged from grinding Victorian poverty, but through education they had bettered themselves. Um, and so they had this very powerful sense of the power of education for social transformation. And it's so much, they observed, achieved in their native Scotland. And there was simply no sense of why it should be wrong to try and do the same thing in sub-Saharan Africa. So the figure that you might touch on is Robert Laws, who comes from just such a background, and he goes out to Malawi specifically because he, as a boy, he's so infatuated with the achievements of Livingstone, and he wants to go to exactly the region of the world where Livingstone had operated. And after a very long period of losing many colleagues to disease and one unsuccessful mission after another, he eventually founds a mission that really does flourish up on a very remote plateau in northern Malawi, high up above the lakeshore. And it's overwhelmingly successful. I mean, he manages to draw in very different tribes who are attracted to what is the miraculous fruits of civilization which are being exhibited there. He's technically extremely competent. He's actually trained as a medical missionary like Livingstone. So he sets up a hospital, he's working as a surgeon at the same time as he's preaching, at the same time as he's trying to introduce novel agricultural techniques, at the same time as he's building, stone buildings in stone, which have never been seen before in the territory of Malawi. He even teaches himself electrical engineering to establish the first hydroelectric power station to power the mission station in the early years of the 20th century. But the real extraordinary achievement is in education, and he establishes this Overton Institute, which you mentioned, specifically to try to bring what he called the all of the spiritual treasures of mankind to local people. But I think, as with the achievements of all of these figures, it's so important to just think about the actual concrete reality they were confronted with when they arrived. So apart from the fact that he's been lucky enough to avoid dying of fever, like so many of his colleagues, just to begin the task of teaching people literacy, he has to learn local languages from scratch, and he learned 5 or so of them. He then has to compile a dictionary, which he does. And they've all got such robust academic training, especially in classics, that they have the philological apparatus in order to produce these, you know, grammars and orthographies and dictionaries of local languages. Only then is he in a position to start translating the Bible into a local language. And only when he's accomplished all of this is he in a position to start teaching someone how to read it. So all of this enormous groundwork and this enormous intellectual energy has had to be expended alongside everything else he's doing before he can begin to teach people the written word. But when he does so, the result is so explosive. There is so much excitement and appetite for literacy among local peoples that he soon discovers that he can expand his curriculum. And so he realized he can start teaching them Latin and then Greek and Hebrew and philosophy and theology and literature and history. And it becomes this unbelievably ambitious academic program, which by the time colonial authorities begin to assert any measure of control, attracts skepticism, because from the point of view of a more narrow-minded colonialist approach, the attitude was, what on earth are you doing teaching these academic luxuries when we want workers trained in basic vocational skills? But he was always absolutely adamant that it was about cultivating intellects, cultivating spiritual depth, especially because he wanted local clergymen, but also wanting to promote independence of mind amongst local peoples. And I had this extraordinary experience where I related this anecdote, which was actually told by an English anthropologist who came out from SOAS in the 1940s to ascertain levels of educational attainment in this part of northern Malawi. And she was walking in the hills, and she comes across a young Ngoni warrior walking in the hills on his own with a spear in one hand and a book in the other. And when she explores with him, it's a copy of Plato's Republic. Now, I related this anecdote to a fellow Oxford graduate, my age, civil servant, who had worked for the Department for International Development as then was, and he physically winced when I told him this, and then just muttered something with horror about cultural imperialism. Now, the absurd irony is that if this was cultural imperialism, it spectacularly backfired, because from Lawes's Overton Institute, you suddenly get this blossoming of Malawian intellectuals who become pastors and writers and poets and are the founders of a startlingly substantial body of Malawian literature, which continues to flourish to this day. And crucially, these were the figures who ended up becoming the independence leaders, who, most of them in their own lifetimes, saw the country's transition to independence through their own mostly overwhelmingly peaceful activism. So the idea that these people were sort of somehow being mentally shackled by alien modes of thought and feeling, which is Ngugi's thesis in the book I mentioned, The Colonized Mind, is, I'm afraid, I think, highly flawed, especially when you contrast it, as I think it's necessary to do, with the alternative, which was the Arab imperialism, which was encroaching so deep into Central Africa at that moment. I mean, in the middle to the end of the 19th century, there are offshoots of the Omani Arab Empire establishing sultanates deep in today's Democratic Republic of Congo. And that was the alternative. But when you think about, if you're going to sort of bandy around ideas of cultural imperialism, that's the contrast you have to draw, because that was the alternative reality. And the thing that staggers me is that in over the best part of 800 or 900 years of Arab domination of certainly the East African coast, the spread of literacy is so fantastically limited. It's restricted to the offspring of Arab elites, Arab elites and their offspring, usually fathered from slaves. And their approach to the continent was purely one of exploitation. It was just about taking slaves, taking ivory, and absolutely no interest whatever in the edification of the peoples on whom they were predating.
Alex, I know you're not Christian. I think it's clear that you have a deep admiration for those Christian missionaries and everything that they achieved whilst they were in Malawi. And we've talked a little bit about the impotence of foreign aid work, and indeed, you could argue the culture of the foreign aid workers. And I suppose my question is could anything meaningful like Laws and Livingston, the Overton Institute, could any of that happened if we sent people with the mindset we have today toward the world and ourselves, transplanted ourselves in Malawi? Do you think we would have done anything as meaningful with regards to literacy, civilization, culture, the 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 rediscovery or indeed discovery of Malawi's own culture and heritage and indeed language? Would any of that happen, do you think, if we had gone in with the way that we think about the world today?
Well, I think manifestly not. As mentioned previously, Malawi is not alone in being the target of decades and billions of decades of time and energy and billions of dollars devoted to its uplift, and yet so very little achieved. And I think if one difference between the approach of contemporary development workers and the missionaries that I've described, if there's one difference that trumps others, it must be the belief in the project. I don't see any real belief in the project. The missionaries I've described were willing to die for the cause of evangelization and civilization in sub-Saharan Africa, and they did die in droves. I mean, they were so accustomed to the idea that they might need to give their lives to this cause that it became a habit among them to choose their epitaphs on the long outward journey from Britain to Africa. Now, however much today's development workers might protest their passion for international development, I see none of them, perhaps the exception of yes, the handful who really do go to expose their lives in very dangerous places, but those are a minority, a very small minority. I see the opposite. I see them wanting to embrace the holiday lifestyle that I had described earlier. And how should that surprise anyone? I mean, who is going to be willing to sacrifice anything much at all, let alone their life, for, say, a gender-sensitive, community-based disaster preparedness program sponsored by the EU. I mean, that is not something which is going to stir that spirit of total sacrifice. And we can see, that how this sort of um, um, failure of self belief played out, because we have a perfect example of it in the catastrophic Western experiment in Afghanistan. Now, admittedly, it didn't. I mean, the time scale we're talking about in Malawi also, and in much of sub-Saharan Africa, has to be reflected on. It's very, very short. The British are in Malawi for 60, 70 years, meaningfully. Of course, it's only 20 years in Afghanistan, but I sense that a large part of the failure of that mission, setting aside the strategic and military challenges, which I'm not qualified to comment, was a failure of belief in what we were trying to achieve, or even an inability to even outline or identify what we were trying to achieve. In one tiny anecdote, I think, was so revealing of this. There was a educational project that was filmed in Afghanistan, in which some rather slowly English girls on what seemed like gap years had been dispatched to teach local women about Western art. And I got the sense they were all having a very jolly time. But apart from that, what was the item of Western art which they'd chosen to educate locals about? It was Marcel Duchamp's fountain, the urinal statue, which is notorious as a statement of repudiation of the entire canon of Western art. Now, I don't believe anybody is really going to bring anything even approximating the level of self-belief which allowed the missionaries in the region I'm concerned with to achieve what they did, to the promotion of Duchamp's fountain in Central London.
I think there is a whole other set of conversations we could be opening up here, specifically about Malawi's relationship to formative moments in human life, and indeed the things that make us human, and how instructive that is for our own English culture and the things we've lost over time in respect of rituals and traditions. I think we should do a part two, Alex, because as we were talking before we pressed record, we have a lot of overlap with regards to the predicament of England, and I think this is probably a good place to wrap up the observations about Malawi and what that teaches us about Britain and the West and our own history as well as theirs. But before we wrap up fully, I'd like to ask you the same question that I ask all of my guests who come on the show, which is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life? Perhaps you thought it was an absolute, maybe it was something smaller day to day, but it felt significant that you changed your mind. And what was it that made you think differently?
Um, I mean, I think one of the things that I enjoy about practicing medicine actually is the fact that you're sort of almost constantly sort of required to change your mind, as you're constantly revising your diagnosis, constantly reassessing your patient's response to treatment. But not just that, on the less technical side, I think it's the way that patients can surprise you with the way that they respond to situations. But I have the feeling this is not really not really the sort of the idea behind the question. So I suppose I would turn my mind back to the period after my first degree in classics, when I left thinking that actually all that I really cared about, was concerned about, was the art and the literature that I loved, and I believed it was possible to live a life cocooned from the world of, certainly, politics, which I found so distasteful, and to some extent still do. And I tried to sort of labour under that belief for quite a long time, but I could not avoid the uncomfortable questions of, why was it that nobody else, why did so few other people seem to share my affection for the products of Western culture which I so loved? Why actually were so many people rejecting them? Why was it not possible? Why was nothing equivalent being produced today? And I found myself confronted with the reality that I could not cocoon myself in the way that I'd hoped. That actually the things that I loved were under threat from people who were inclined to, from ignorance, from resentment of them, from actual active hostility towards them, and that actually, unfortunately, a level of, broadly speaking, political engagement was necessary to think about those questions. I certainly don't mean at a party political level, something which still I find it very difficult to interest myself in, but in the broader sense of the term, a reluctant realization that that on some level the politics was also necessary.
It's fascinating you say that, and it's calling to mind a literary reference which I think many of us in the 21st century fall back on, and indeed I think I even noticed Elon Musk do it of late. But Tolkien is clearly very influential for people. Often some of the biggest tomes of literature people have read, and also very instructive for the English mind itself. And effectively what I hear you saying is you felt like in the end you've been called away from your hobbit hole to the edge of the Shire, realizing that somehow you have to defend it in your own way. And I think Musk goes on to talk about ultimately the reason why the Shire could be so peaceable is that there were people beyond it, the men of Gondor, who were effectively keeping it safe. And I know this is taken on with quite a lot of the Zoomers of a conservative bent, that they talk about having to be the men of Gondor, that if you want a Shire, then you've got to go out and protect it in whichever way you think necessary. So it's something that I grapple with quite a lot as well. And as an Englishman, I've often thought, I mean, I live up in the northeast of England, away from big cities and all the rest of it. Sometimes there's been this fervent hope that I could cocoon myself off and not deal with the decadence and the decay and the febrile atmosphere and all the rest of it, and then realizing that actually you can never really do that. It's always there. It's just whether you choose to look it in the face or not. Alex, your book is wonderful, and I think people would do very well to read it to be able to understand the fruits as well as the rotten fruits of Western civilization, because you express these ideas obviously through the lens of your own experiences. And I think for that reason, it comes across very differently. It's not a polemic. It isn't overly academic. It is spoken at that human level, and I think people will get it. And I think there are a lot of subtleties in there, but they, whilst not explicit, they can be felt to be explicit. So it is magnificent. And just if you it didn't get bigger praise enough, as we were speaking before the call, you managed prior to his passing to get this book in front of Sir Roger Scruton, who you did not know and who loved it, and you ended up in correspondence with him. So when Sir Roger Scruton gives you the stamp of approval, and indeed Lord Nigel Bigger as well, who's been on the show a couple of times, I think that tells everyone what they need to know, which is this book is well worth reading. Go out and read it. And Alex, I know you're working on another. I don't know if it's too soon to say when we might expect it, if it comes to fruition, but otherwise, where can people find you in the darker corners of the internet and get to know your work?
Yes, good question. I'm not very good at dark corners of the internet, I have to confess. I do have an X account, Alexander Chula, as I think the whatever you call it, tag handle.
Yeah,
I'm not an avid tweeter, but there is a presence there.
Good. Well, I should probably be more of an avid tweeter myself, given I have a podcast, but much like you, typically sitting in the background. Alex, it has been an absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next conversation where we can get into the predicament of England, and all the various different aspects of our current malaise and what we might and do about it as well. But in the meantime, keep fighting the good fight. Good luck with your book writing, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you ever so much, John, for the invitation and for the very, very kind words about my book as well.
You're very welcome. All the best.